The alarm clock buzzed at 6 in the morning, just like it did every weekday. Leo reached over and shut it off, then sat up slowly in his small bedroom. The apartment wasn't much. Just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a leaky faucet he kept meaning to fix. But it was his, and the rent was something he could actually afford on his salary. He shuffled to the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror while brushing his teeth. At 32 years old, he looked pretty average. Brown hair that was starting to thin a little at the temples, a face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, and hands that were calloused from years of careful work. Those hands were the only remarkable thing about him, though nobody really paid attention to them. Leo worked as a piano tuner. Had been doing it for 6 years now, ever since he moved to the city. He worked for a music store called Anderson's, located right in the fancy part of town where all the expensive shops were. The store sold high-end pianos to people who had more money than Leo would probably see in his entire lifetime. His job was to keep those pianos sounding perfect. It was honest work. Not exciting, but honest. He'd wake up, go to the store, and spend his days adjusting strings and hammers, making sure each note rang out clean and true. Sometimes he'd work in the store's back room, and sometimes he'd get sent out to people's houses to tune the pianos they'd bought. Either way, it was quiet work. Peaceful, even. That Tuesday morning, Leo made himself some instant coffee and ate a piece of toast while standing at his kitchen counter. He didn't own a dining table, never saw the point when it was just him. After breakfast, he put on his work clothes. Blue button-up shirt, dark pants, and the same pair of work boots he'd been wearing for 3 years. Nothing fancy, but clean and presentable. The drive to Anderson's took about 20 minutes. Leo pulled his old pickup truck into the employee parking lot behind the store and walked in through the back entrance. His boss, Mr. Anderson, was already there, sitting in his office with the door open. "Leo, come in here for a minute," Mr. Anderson called out when he saw him. Leo walked into the small office. Mr. Anderson was a gray-haired man in his 60s who'd owned the store for over 30 years. He was fair, paid on time, and didn't make Leo feel bad about his worn-out boots. That was more than Leo could say for most bosses he'd had. "Got a special job for you today," Mr. Anderson said, pulling out a folder. "House call, big one. It's for Mrs. Victoria Harrington." Leo knew that name. Everyone in the city did. Victoria Harrington was one of those wealthy socialites who threw fancy parties and got her picture in the newspaper all the time. She lived in Preston Heights, the neighborhood where houses cost millions and had names instead of just addresses. "She called this morning," Mr. Anderson continued. "Needs her piano tuned right away. She's got some big charity event happening this weekend, and apparently the piano needs to be in perfect condition. It's a Steinway Grand. One of the vintage models." "Sure thing," Leo said. "I can head over there this morning." Mr. Anderson handed him a slip of paper with the address written on it. "Listen, Leo, Mrs. Harrington is, well, she's particular. Important client. Just do the work, keep your head down, and we'll be fine." "Okay," Leo nodded. He'd dealt with rich people before. Most of them treated him like he was invisible, which was fine by him. He could tune the piano, collect the payment, and leave without any fuss. By 9:30, Leo was driving through Preston Heights. The neighborhood was like something out of a movie. Huge houses set back from the road, surrounded by massive lawns and tall trees. Some of the properties had gates with security cameras. Others had tennis courts visible from the street. Every mailbox probably cost more than Leo's monthly rent. When he found the Harrington house, he had to double-check the address. The place was enormous. It was built in that old colonial style, all white with tall columns in front. The driveway curved through a perfectly landscaped garden, and a fountain sat right in the middle of the circular drive. 3 cars were parked near the garage, a Mercedes, a BMW, and something Leo didn't even recognize but knew was expensive. He parked his beat-up truck next to the fancy cars and felt suddenly very aware of how out of place he looked. The truck had rust spots on the bumper and a cracked taillight he hadn't gotten around to replacing. It looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a dog show. Leo grabbed his toolbox from the back and walked up to the front door. The door itself was huge and made of dark wood with intricate carvings. He rang the doorbell and heard it echo inside the house like church bells. A woman in a black and white uniform opened the door. Her expression went from neutral to annoyed the moment she saw him. "Deliveries and service people use the back entrance," she said, starting to close the door. I'm the piano tuner, Leo said quickly, holding up his toolbox. From Anderson's music store. The woman, probably a housekeeper or maid, let out an irritated sigh. Wait here. She shut the door in his face. Leo stood on the front porch for a good 5 minutes, feeling awkward and out of place. He could hear the muffled sound of voices inside. Finally, the door opened again. Follow me, the woman said coldly, and wipe your feet. Leo followed her inside, making sure to scrape his boots on the doormat even though they were already clean. The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Everything was white marble and gold accents. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Oil paintings and fancy frames covered the walls. The furniture looked like the kind you'd see in a museum, the type you weren't supposed to actually sit on. They walked through what felt like a maze of rooms. A sitting room. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20 people. A hallway with more paintings. Finally, the maid stopped in front of a set of double doors and pushed them open. The ballroom, she announced, like Leo should be impressed. And honestly, he was. The room was massive, with a ceiling that must have been 25 feet high. Tall windows lined one wall, letting in streams of morning sunlight. The floor was polished wood that gleamed like glass. And right there in the center of it all, positioned perfectly to catch the light, was the piano. It was a Steinway Model D grand piano, and it was gorgeous. The black finish was so shiny Leo could see his reflection in it. The music stand was intricately carved. Even from across the room, he could tell this instrument was worth more money than he'd make in 5 years. Mrs. Harrington will be in shortly, the maid said. Then she left, her footsteps clicking away down the marble hallway. Leo was alone in the ballroom. He set his toolbox down carefully on the floor and approached the piano. He ran his hand along the smooth lid, feeling the cool surface under his palm. Gently, he lifted the lid and propped it open to look at the strings and hammers inside. The piano was old, probably from the 1930s based on the serial number, but it had been maintained beautifully. The strings were still bright, the hammers showed even wear, and the soundboard looked solid. Whoever had owned this piano before Mrs. Harrington had taken excellent care of it. Leo pulled the piano bench out and sat down. He pressed a few keys gently, listening to the tone. The piano was only slightly out of tune, probably from the change in weather. Nothing major. This would be an easy job. He was just starting to unpack his tools when he heard voices. Women's voices laughing about something. The ballroom doors opened and a group of 4 women walked in, each holding a teacup and saucer. The woman leading the group had to be Mrs. Victoria Harrington. She was in her late 50s, dressed in an expensive-looking cream pantsuit. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place. Diamond earrings caught the light when she turned her head, and a matching necklace sat at her throat. Everything about her screamed money. She glanced at Leo the way you might glance at a piece of furniture. Her eyes passed right over him without really seeing him. "Oh, you're here already. Good," she said in a voice that was used to giving orders. "The piano must be absolutely perfect by Friday evening. I've hired a pianist from Boston to perform at my charity gala. He's very accomplished. Studied at the New England Conservatory. Performed all over Europe. Very exclusive." "Yes, ma'am," Leo said quietly. "I'll make sure everything sounds perfect." "I'm sure you will," Mrs. Harrington said, already turning away from him. "Ladies, let's finish our tea in the sitting room. We have so much to discuss about the event." The women filed into an adjoining room that Leo could see through an open doorway. It was decorated with plush couches and more expensive-looking furniture. They settled in with their tea, close enough that Leo could hear every word they said. Leo tried to focus on his work, but it was hard to ignore the conversation happening in the next room. The women weren't exactly whispering. Their voices carried easily across the marble floors and through the open doorway. He pulled out his tuning hammer and electronic tuner from his toolbox. Starting with middle C, he began the careful process of adjusting each string. It was delicate work that required total concentration. He'd press a key, listen to the note, check it against his tuner, then make tiny adjustments with the hammer. Sometimes a quarter turn of a tuning pin was too much. It had to be perfect. "So Victoria, tell us more about this pianist you've hired," one of the women said from the sitting room. "You mentioned he's performed in Europe." Mrs. Harrington's voice rang out, full of pride. "Oh yes, Andrew Chen, absolutely brilliant. He's performed in Vienna, Paris, London. He studied under some of the greatest teachers at the New England Conservatory." His fee for one evening is more than most people make in a month. But for my gala, only the best will do." The other women made impressed sounds. Leo kept working, moving from C to C sharp, then to D. Each note had to harmonize perfectly with the ones around it. His grandmother had taught him that a piano wasn't just 88 individual notes. It was one instrument and every part had to work together. "I heard Margaret Thornton tried to book him first," another woman chimed in. "She must be green with envy that you got him instead." Mrs. Harrington laughed. "Well, Margaret should have called sooner. You know I always get the best entertainment for my events. Last year I had that violinist from the New York Philharmonic, remember? And the year before, that opera singer from Milan." Leo had tuned about 20 keys when one of the women said something that made him pause. "Victoria, is that the piano tuner in there?" The voice was curious, almost amused. "Yes, that's him," Mrs. Harrington replied. "From Anderson's. They're the only shop in the city I trust with my Steinway." "Does he play?" the woman asked. Leo felt his stomach tighten. He kept his eyes on his work, hoping they'd drop the subject. "I have no idea," Mrs. Harrington said. "I suppose he must know something about pianos to tune them." "Why do you ask, Patricia?" "Oh, I don't know. I was just thinking it might be interesting to hear him play something. You know, see what he can do." Leo's hand stilled on the keys. "Please don't," he thought. "Just let me do my job and leave." But Mrs. Harrington was already warming to the idea. He could hear the amusement creeping into her voice. "That's actually rather funny. I suppose we could ask him. It might be entertaining." The word entertaining stung. Leo knew exactly what she meant. They wanted to have a laugh at his expense. Watch the working class piano tuner fumble through some simple tunes so they could feel superior about their expensive education and their fancy pianist from Boston. He heard the rustle of fabric and footsteps on marble. The women were coming into the ballroom. Leo didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the piano keys, hoping they'd change their minds. "Excuse me," Mrs. Harrington's voice came from behind him. "Mr. Leo," he said quietly, still not turning around. "Just Leo." "Leo. My friends and I were wondering something." Her voice had that tone adults use when they're about to ask a child to perform a trick. "Do you play piano or do you only tune them?" "I play a little," Leo said, keeping his answer short. Maybe if he didn't encourage them, they'd lose interest. "Oh, how wonderful," Patricia said, clapping her hands together. "You simply must play something for us. Just a little song. We'd love to hear it." Leo finally turned around on the bench. The four women stood there in their expensive clothes, holding their teacups, smiling at him like he was a curiosity. Mrs. Harrington's smile was the worst. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind that said she was already prepared to be disappointed and find it amusing. "I really should finish the tuning." "Ma'am," Leo said, looking at Mrs. Harrington. "You said you needed it done by Friday, and I want to make sure—" "Oh, nonsense!" Mrs. Harrington waved her hand dismissively. "You can spare 5 minutes. Come on, play us something. What do you know? Can you play chopsticks? Or maybe that heart and soul song? Something fun and simple." The other women giggled. They actually giggled like they were schoolgirls instead of grown women in their 50s. Leo felt heat rising in his face. Not from anger exactly. More from embarrassment. From the shame of being treated like a performing monkey. "I'm sure you know at least one song," another woman added. Her name tag from some charity event was still pinned to her blazer. Helen something. "Don't be shy. We're not critics. We just want to hear what someone who works with pianos all day can actually do." Mrs. Harrington moved closer, her smile widening. "Yes, please, humor us. I'm genuinely curious. You must have picked up something from being around these instruments so much. Can you read music, or do you play by ear?" There was a challenge in her voice now. She was testing him, pushing to see if he'd refuse. And if he did refuse, she'd probably tell Mr. Anderson that the tuner from his shop had been rude and uncooperative. Leo couldn't afford to lose this job. He had rent to pay, bills stacking up on his kitchen counter. He looked at the four women standing there waiting for their entertainment, waiting to laugh at whatever simple tune he might peck out. Mrs. Harrington took a sip of her tea, that smile still playing on her lips. She was so certain she knew exactly what was about to happen. "You want me to play something?" Leo asked quietly. "Yes, please do," Mrs. Harrington said. "Don't worry, we won't judge too harshly. We just want to hear a little something. Surely you can manage Mary Had a Little Lamb or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Those are easy enough, aren't they?" The other women giggled again. Patricia actually covered her mouth like she was trying to hold in her laughter. They thought this was hilarious. The poor piano tuner being asked to play in front of his betters. Leo took a slow breath. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Music isn't about showing off, Leo, it's about truth. About showing people something real, something that touches them here. She'd tap her chest when she said it, right in the heart. He looked down at the piano keys. The ivory was smooth under his fingers, worn down by decades of other hands. This piano had been played by countless people over its 90-year life. It had made music for weddings and parties, for quiet Sunday afternoons and lonely evenings. It deserved respect. All right, Leo said finally. I'll play something for you. Wonderful, Mrs. Harrington said, gesturing to her friends. Ladies, let's sit and enjoy the show. The women settled themselves on the plush chairs near the windows, arranging their expensive dresses and crossing their legs elegantly. They looked like they were at a concert, except the expressions on their faces weren't anticipation. They were amusement. They were ready to be entertained by his failure. Mrs. Harrington remained standing closer to the piano. Her teacup was raised halfway to her lips. That smile was still there, smug and certain. What are you going to play for us? Helen asked. Something we might recognize? Leo adjusted his position on the bench. He flexed his fingers once, twice. His grandmother had taught him to always warm up properly, but there wasn't time for that now. Besides, his hands remembered. Even after years of tuning instead of performing, his hands remembered everything. I'm going to play Rachmaninoff, Leo said quietly. Piano Concerto No. 3. There was a moment of silence. Patricia actually laughed out loud, then covered her mouth when she realized he wasn't joking. Mrs. Harrington's smile flickered, just for a second. She clearly thought he was either lying or delusional. That's one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano, she said slowly. Are you sure you don't want to play something a bit simpler? That piece requires years of professional training. Leo didn't answer. He placed his hands on the keys, positioning his fingers exactly how his grandmother had taught him 25 years ago. He could hear her voice in his head. Feel the music first, Leo. Don't just play the notes. Feel what Rachmaninoff was feeling when he wrote this. Feel his heart. He closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he began to play. The first notes came soft and gentle, almost questioning. Then they built, growing stronger and more insistent. Leo's fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that came from muscle memory so deep, it was like breathing. The music poured out of the Steinway, filling every corner of that massive ballroom. Mrs. Harrington's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Her smile had completely vanished. The music swept through the ballroom like a storm. Leo's fingers flew across the keys, moving so fast they almost blurred. The melody twisted and turned, climbing higher and higher before plunging down into deep, thunderous bass notes that made the crystal chandelier above them tremble slightly. This wasn't simple music. This was Rachmaninoff, complex, emotional, demanding. Every measure required absolute precision. One wrong note, one missed key, and the entire piece would fall apart. But Leo's hands knew exactly where to go. They'd played this concerto hundreds of times over the years, first learning it measure by measure under his grandmother's patient guidance, then perfecting it through countless hours of practice. Mrs. Harrington's mouth had fallen open. The teacup in her hand tilted dangerously to one side, but she didn't seem to notice. She just stood there, frozen, staring at Leo's hands as they danced across the keyboard. Patricia had set her own teacup down on a side table. Her hand was pressed against her chest and her eyes were wide with shock. Helen had risen from her chair without even realizing it, drawn forward by the music like a moth to a flame. The fourth woman, Leo hadn't caught her name, had actual tears forming in her eyes. She was the only one who seemed to understand what she was hearing. The only one who recognized that what was happening in this ballroom right now was something extraordinary. Leo barely noticed them. When he played like this, the rest of the world faded away. There was only the piano, the music, and the memories of his grandmother sitting beside him on an old worn piano bench in her small living room. Feel it here, she'd say, tapping her heart. Rachmaninoff wrote this when he was homesick, when he missed Russia so much it hurt. Every note carries that longing. You have to make people feel that longing too. Leo felt it now. He poured everything into the music. All those years of living in a small apartment, working a job that most people didn't even notice. All the times he'd walked into fancy houses like this one and been treated like he was invisible. All the loneliness of being the only person who remembered his grandmother's voice, her laugh, the way her fingers would guide his across the keys. The music swelled. His left hand hammered out powerful chords while his right hand raced through a series of notes so fast they sounded like a waterfall. This was the part where most pianists made mistakes, where the technical difficulty became almost impossible. But Leo didn't hesitate. His hands knew what to do. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His shoulders ached from the intensity of the movement. Playing Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto was like running a marathon with your fingers. It demanded everything you had: physical strength, mental focus, and emotional depth. The melody shifted again, becoming softer, more tender. This was the part that always reminded Leo of his grandmother. The gentle section that sounded like a lullaby, like someone singing to a child. His grandmother had hummed this melody sometimes while cooking dinner, her voice cracked with age but still carrying the tune perfectly. Mrs. Harrington had finally set down her teacup. Both of her hands were now pressed against her mouth. Her face had gone pale, then flushed red. Whatever she had expected when she asked Leo to play, it wasn't this. Nothing could have prepared her for this. The music built toward its climax. Leo's entire body moved with the rhythm now, swaying slightly as his hands crossed over each other, reaching for keys at opposite ends of the keyboard. The Steinway responded beautifully, its vintage soundboard producing tones that were rich and full. Exactly what Rachmaninoff had imagined when he composed this piece nearly a century ago. Then came the final section. The part that brought everything together. All the themes from earlier in the concerto returned, woven together in a tapestry of sound that was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Leo's grandmother had once told him that this ending was Rachmaninoff's way of saying goodbye to everything he loved. A farewell that was also a celebration. Leo's finger struck the final chord, letting it ring out through the ballroom. The note sustained, gradually fading until the only sound was the echo bouncing off the high ceiling and marble walls. Then silence. Leo sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the keys, his chest rising and falling from the exertion. He just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire, without a single mistake. His fingers ached. His back was sore. But there was also that familiar feeling of peace that always came after playing something beautiful. Slowly, he lifted his hands from the piano and placed them in his lap. Only then did he remember that he wasn't alone, that 4 women had just witnessed what happened. He turned around on the bench. Mrs. Harrington stood exactly where she'd been before, but she looked completely different. Her face was no longer arranged in that smug, superior smile. Instead, she looked shocked, stunned, like someone had just slapped her across the face. Patricia was crying openly now, not even trying to hide the tears streaming down her cheeks. She was shaking her head slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Helen had sunk back into her chair. She was staring at Leo with an expression he couldn't quite read. Respect? Disbelief? Maybe both. The 4th woman was the first to move. She started clapping. Her hands came together in slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the silent ballroom. Then Patricia joined her, still crying. Then Helen, Mrs. Harrington, didn't clap. She just stood there, her hands still pressed against her mouth, staring at Leo like she was seeing him for the first time. That was... Patricia's voice cracked. She had to clear her throat and try again. That was extraordinary. I've heard professional pianists at Carnegie Hall who couldn't play that piece as well as you just did. Where did you learn to play like that? Helen asked. Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. That's not something you pick up as a hobby. That's years of serious training. Leo stood up from the bench slowly. His legs felt shaky. It had been a long time since he'd played for anyone other than himself. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving him tired and strangely vulnerable. My grandmother taught me, he said simply. Your grandmother? The 4th woman stepped closer. She must have been an incredible teacher. Was she a professional musician? Leo nodded. She was a concert pianist. A long time ago. Mrs. Harrington finally lowered her hands from her mouth. When she spoke, her voice came out rough, like her throat was tight. What was her name? Catherine Volkoff, Leo said. The effect of that name on the room was instantaneous. Patricia actually gasped. Helen's hand flew to her chest. The 4th woman's eyes went wide. But it was Mrs. Harrington's reaction that struck Leo the most. All the color drained from her face. She reached out blindly for something to steady herself, her hand finding the back of a chair. "Catherine Volkov," she repeated, barely above a whisper. "Catherine Volkov was your grandmother." Leo was confused by their reactions. "Yes, did you know her?" "Know her?" Patricia said, her voice filled with emotion. "Catherine Volkov was one of the greatest pianists of her generation. I saw her perform once when I was 18 years old, in Vienna. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. She performed all over the world," Helen added. "Moscow, Paris, London, New York. She was extraordinary. And then?" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "And then there was that scandal," the fourth woman finished quietly, "with her manager. The accusations. It destroyed her career." Leo nodded slowly. He knew the story. His grandmother had told him about it once, late one night when he was 17. How her manager had stolen money from her and blamed her for it. How the newspapers had painted her as a fraud and a thief. How concert halls had canceled her performances. How she'd gone from playing for thousands to playing for no one. She was innocent, Leo said firmly. The manager confessed years later, but by then it was too late. No one cared anymore. She'd been forgotten. "Not by everyone," Patricia said softly. "I never forgot that performance in Vienna. I've been chasing that feeling my entire life. That moment when music is so perfect it makes you feel like you're touching something divine." Mrs. Harrington finally found her voice. "She taught you everything?" "Everything," Leo confirmed. "From the time I was 6 until she passed away 5 years ago. Every day after school I'd go to her house. She had this old upright piano in her living room. We'd sit together at that bench for hours." "And you became a piano tuner?" Mrs. Harrington asked. There was no judgment in her voice now, only genuine confusion. "Why aren't you performing? With that level of skill you could be playing in concert halls." Leo shrugged. "My grandmother taught me that music isn't about fame or applause. It's about the music itself. About respecting the instrument and the beauty it can create. I tune pianos because I love pianos. I play because it makes me feel close to her. I don't need anything more than that." The room fell silent again. Mrs. Harrington was still staring at him, but her expression had completely changed. Mrs. Harrington walked slowly toward the piano. Her expensive heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate and heavy. When she reached the Steinway, she placed one hand on its polished surface, almost like she was steadying herself. "I need to sit down," she said quietly. Patricia rushed to pull a chair closer, and Mrs. Harrington sank into it. She looked nothing like the confident, sharp-tongued woman who had walked into the ballroom 30 minutes ago. Now she just looked tired, and maybe a little bit ashamed. "I don't know what to say," Mrs. Harrington began, her voice barely above a whisper. I assumed. You assumed I was just some guy who tunes pianos," Leo finished for her. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was just stating the obvious. She nodded slowly, not meeting his eyes. "Yes, I did. And She stopped, took a breath, then started again. "I'm deeply sorry. The way I spoke to you. The way I asked you to play like it was some kind of joke. That was wrong. It was cruel." Leo hadn't expected an apology. In his experience, people like Mrs. Harrington didn't apologize to people like him. They just moved on and pretended nothing had happened. The fact that she was actually saying the words out loud surprised him more than anything else that had happened today. "I accept your apology," he said simply. "Catherine Volkov," Patricia said again, shaking her head in wonder. "I can't believe she was your grandmother. I saw her perform in 1982. I was just a college student studying abroad. My roommate dragged me to this concert in Vienna because she had an extra ticket. I didn't even want to go. I thought classical music was boring." She laughed, but there were still tears on her cheeks. "But then your grandmother walked onto that stage. She was wearing this deep blue dress and her hair was pulled back. And when she started playing, God, it was like the whole world stopped. I'd never heard anything like it. I sat in that concert hall and cried like a baby." "She had that effect on people," Leo said softly. His grandmother had never talked much about her performing days, but he'd seen the old programs she kept in a box under her bed. The newspaper reviews calling her a prodigy, a virtuoso, a once-in-a-generation talent. Helen spoke up. I remember when the scandal broke. It was all over the news. They said she'd been embezzling money from her own concerts, that her manager had proof. Her manager was stealing from her, Leo said, his voice harder now. He'd been doing it for years, taking money from ticket sales, from her performance fees. When she finally discovered what he was doing and confronted him, he turned it around on her. He had access to all her accounts, all her records. He made it look like she was the thief. And by the time the truth came out, it was too late, the fourth woman said sadly. The damage was done. Leo nodded. She tried to fight it at first. Hired lawyers, gave interviews, but nobody wanted to hear it. The story of a famous musician stealing money was more interesting than the story of a manager betraying his client. Within a year, all her contracts were canceled. Concert halls wouldn't book her. Recording companies wouldn't return her calls. What did she do? Mrs. Harrington asked. She was looking at Leo now, really looking at him. She came here, to this city. She had a little bit of money saved that her manager hadn't gotten to. She bought a small house in the old neighborhood, the one they tore down to build the new highway. She gave piano lessons to a few students. That's how she made ends meet. And she taught you, Patricia said. She taught me. Leo confirmed. I was 6 years old the first time I sat at her piano. My mom was working 2 jobs and needed someone to watch me after school. My grandmother said she'd do it. But instead of just babysitting, she taught me to play. Leo walked over to one of the tall windows and looked out at the perfectly manicured garden. Every day for 12 years, I'd go to her house after school. We'd sit at that old upright piano. Nothing fancy like this Steinway, just a beaten-up old thing she'd bought secondhand. And she'd teach me. She must have been an incredible teacher, Helen said. She was patient, Leo said. That was the thing about her. She'd had all this fame, all this success, and it had been taken from her unfairly. But she never became bitter. She never took it out on me. She just loved music, purely and simply. And she wanted me to love it too. He turned back to face the women. She taught me that music isn't about impressing people or making money or getting famous. It's about creating something beautiful in the moment. Something that touches people's hearts, even if only one person hears it, even if nobody hears it but you. Mrs. Harrington stood up from her chair. She walked over to where Leo stood by the window. Up close, he could see that her eyes were red, like she'd been fighting back tears. My charity gala, she said slowly. The one on Friday night. The pianist I hired just called this morning to cancel. That's why I was so on edge when you arrived. I was stressed about finding a replacement on such short notice. Leo waited. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. Would you play at my gala? Mrs. Harrington asked. I know it's a lot to ask, especially after how I treated you. But what you just played, that was extraordinary. My guests would be hearing something truly special. Leo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Steinway, then back at Mrs. Harrington. I don't perform at events, he said finally. I play for myself, for my grandmother's memory. That's enough for me. Please, Mrs. Harrington said. I'll pay you whatever you ask. Name your price. It's not about money, Leo said. Then what is it about? She asked. She sounded genuinely confused, like she couldn't understand why someone would turn down what she was offering. Leo thought about his grandmother. About those afternoons in her small living room, with the late sun coming through the windows and dust motes floating in the air. About the way she'd smile when he finally got a difficult passage right. About how she'd never cared that she wasn't performing in concert halls anymore, because she had something better. A grandson who loved music as much as she did. My grandmother spent the last 20 years of her life in obscurity, Leo said. Nobody remembered her. Nobody cared about her anymore. She could have been angry about that. She could have spent those years bitter and resentful. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But she didn't. Because she understood something that most people don't. She understood that the music itself was the reward, not the applause, not the fame, just the act of creating something beautiful. I understand, Mrs. Harrington said quietly. And you're right. I don't think I've ever really understood that. I've spent so much energy on these events, making sure everything is perfect, making sure people are impressed, but I've forgotten what it's actually about. She looked at Leo with an expression that was different from before. Not superior, not condescending, just human. I would be honored if you would play at my gala, but I understand if you say no. Leo surprised himself by actually considering it. He thought about his grandmother again, about what she would say if she were here. Would she want him to hide his gift away, or would she want him to share it? If I play, Leo said slowly, I don't want to be paid. Mrs. Harrington started to protest, but Leo held up his hand. Whatever you would have paid me, I want you to donate it to music programs. Programs that help kids who can't afford lessons. Kids whose families work 2 jobs and live in small apartments. Kids like I used to be. Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened. That's very generous. It's what my grandmother would have wanted, Leo said. She spent the last part of her life teaching kids who couldn't afford expensive music schools. Some of them couldn't pay her at all. She taught them anyway. Patricia wiped her eyes again. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She was, Leo agreed. And maybe it's time more people knew about her. Not about the scandal, not about what happened to her career, but about who she really was. About what she believed music should be. Mrs. Harrington nodded slowly. When you perform at the gala, I'd like to introduce you properly. To tell people about Catherine Volkoff and her legacy. Would that be all right? Leo thought about it. His grandmother had never wanted attention for herself. She'd always said that the music was what mattered. But maybe this was different. Maybe this was a way to honor her memory. To let people know that Catherine Volkoff hadn't disappeared. That she'd spent her final years doing something even more important than performing, passing on her love of music to the next generation. Yes, Leo said finally. That would be all right. Mrs. Harrington smiled. It was a real smile this time, not the superior, mocking smile from before. This one reached her eyes. Thank you, Leo. Truly. There's one more thing, Leo said. I still need to finish tuning your piano. For the first time since he'd started playing, everyone in the room laughed. It was a genuine laugh, warm and real. Friday evening arrived faster than Leo expected. The 3 days between Tuesday and the gala had been a blur of phone calls from Mrs. Harrington's assistant, confirming details and asking questions about his performance. What pieces would he play? Did he need anything special? Would he like to see the venue beforehand? Leo had kept his answers simple. He'd play a selection of pieces that his grandmother had loved. He didn't need anything special. And no, he didn't need to see the venue. He'd already seen the ballroom when he tuned the piano. Now, standing in his small apartment bathroom, Leo stared at his reflection in the mirror. He'd bought a suit for the occasion. Nothing too expensive, just something decent from a department store. Black jacket, black pants, white shirt. He'd even bought a new tie, though he had to watch a video online to remember how to tie it properly. His hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the tie, not from nervousness about playing. He'd performed that Rachmaninoff concerto hundreds of times in his grandmother's living room. The shaking was from something else, from the feeling that tonight was going to change something fundamental in his life, though he couldn't quite explain what. The drive to Preston Heights felt different this time. When Leo pulled up to the Harrington mansion, there were cars everywhere. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway. Mercedes, BMWs, even a Rolls-Royce. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns were walking up the front steps, laughing and chatting. Leo parked his old truck at the far end of the driveway where it wouldn't stand out too much. He sat there for a moment watching all these wealthy people enter the mansion. They belonged here. He didn't. At least that's what the old Leo would have thought. But then he remembered something his grandmother used to say. Music is the great equalizer, Leo. When you sit at a piano, it doesn't matter where you came from or how much money you have. All that matters is what comes out of your fingers and your heart. Leo got out of the truck and walked toward the mansion. A valet gave his truck a curious look but didn't say anything. The same maid who had been so cold to him on Tuesday was at the door, checking names on a list. When she saw Leo, her expression changed completely. Mr. Leo, she said, and there was actual respect in her voice. Mrs. Harrington is expecting you. Please come in. The mansion had been transformed. The ballroom was lit with what looked like 1,000 candles. Round tables covered in white tablecloths filled the space, each one set with fine china and crystal glasses. Flowers were everywhere, huge arrangements of roses and lilies that probably cost more than Leo's monthly rent. The Steinway grand piano sat on a small raised platform at one end of the ballroom, positioned so everyone could see it. A spotlight had been set up to shine on the piano bench. This was real. This was actually happening, Leo! Mrs. Harrington appeared from the crowd, wearing a floor-length emerald gown that shimmered when she moved. She looked elegant and composed, but Leo could see genuine warmth in her eyes when she smiled at him. I'm so glad you're here. How are you feeling? Nervous, Leo admitted. It's been a long time since I played for anyone other than myself. You're going to be wonderful, she said. Come, let me show you where you can wait until it's time. She led him to a small room off the ballroom, some kind of study with leather chairs and shelves full of books. You can stay here until dinner is over. I'll come get you when we're ready for the performance. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee? Water would be good, Leo said. Mrs. Harrington nodded to someone, and a server appeared moments later with a glass of ice water. After the server left, Mrs. Harrington sat down in one of the leather chairs and gestured for Leo to sit as well. I want you to know something, she said. I've been thinking a lot about what happened on Tuesday, about the way I treated you, and I realized something about myself that I'm not proud of. Leo stayed quiet, letting her speak. I've spent so much of my life focused on status and appearances. Mrs. Harrington continued. Who has the biggest house? Who throws the best parties? Who can hire the most impressive entertainment? I forgot that none of that actually matters. What matters is how we treat people, how we see people. She looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap. You could have embarrassed me on Tuesday. After the way I mocked you, you could have walked out, or played something simple just to prove my assumptions right. But instead, you played something beautiful, something honest, and it made me realize how small I've been. You apologized already, Leo said gently, and you're donating that money to music programs. That's more than most people would do. It's the least I can do, Mrs. Harrington said. Your grandmother spent her life sharing music with people who couldn't afford it. That's a legacy worth honoring. She stood up. I should get back to my guests. But Leo, thank you for giving me this chance to make things right. After she left, Leo sat alone in the study, sipping his water and thinking about his grandmother. He wished she could be here to see this. Not because she'd care about the fancy mansion or the wealthy guests, but because she'd be happy that her music, the music she'd passed down to him, was going to be shared with people who needed to hear it. About an hour later, Mrs. Harrington returned. It's time, she said. Leo followed her out of the study and toward the ballroom. Through the doorway, he could see that dinner had been cleared away. The guests were all seated at their tables, talking quietly among themselves. The spotlight on the piano was bright, almost blinding. Mrs. Harrington walked to the front of the room and picked up a microphone. The conversations died down as everyone turned to face her. Good evening, everyone, she began. Thank you all for coming to support the Children's Medical Foundation. Tonight, we've raised over $200,000 for children's health care, and I'm so grateful to all of you. Polite applause filled the room. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's entertainment, but first I need to tell you a story. Mrs. Harrington's voice became softer, more personal. This week, I learned an important lesson about assumptions and about judging people based on appearances. She told them about Tuesday, about how she'd asked her piano tuner to play something, expecting to be amused by a clumsy performance, about how instead she'd witnessed something extraordinary. As she spoke, Leo could see people in the audience leaning forward. Interested, the man you're about to hear, Mrs. Harrington continued, was taught by one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. His grandmother, Catherine Volkov. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the older guests clearly recognized the name. Catherine Volkov's career was destroyed by a scandal that wasn't her fault, but she didn't let that destroy her love of music. Instead, she spent her final years teaching, passing on her gift to the next generation. Tonight, you're going to hear the result of that legacy. Mrs. Harrington turned and gestured toward the doorway where Leo stood. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Leo Martinez. Leo walked into the ballroom. The applause was polite but expectant. These people had no idea what they were about to hear. They thought they were getting background music for their charity event. He climbed the steps to the platform and sat down at the Steinway. The bench was exactly at the right height. He'd adjusted it himself when he tuned the piano. The keys gleamed under the spotlight. Leo placed his hands on the piano and took a deep breath. Then he began to play. He started with Chopin, a nocturne that his grandmother had loved, one that she said sounded like moonlight on water. The melody was gentle and flowing, filling the ballroom with a kind of liquid beauty. The room went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every glass was set down. People sat perfectly still, listening. After the Chopin, Leo moved into Debussy, then Beethoven. Each piece was one that his grandmother had taught him, one that held a specific memory. He wasn't just playing notes on a keyboard. He was sharing his grandmother's legacy, her love of music, her belief that beauty was worth creating for its own sake. By the time he reached the final piece, the same Rachmaninoff concerto he'd played on Tuesday, there were tears on people's faces. Not just one or two people, dozens of them. Leo's fingers flew across the keys, pouring everything into the music. This was for his grandmother, for all those afternoons in her small living room, for every lesson she'd taught him, not just about music, but about life, about dignity, about finding joy in simple things, about creating beauty even when the world had been unfair. When the final chord faded into silence, nobody moved. The ballroom was so quiet Leo could hear his own breathing. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, then another. Then everyone was on their feet, applauding so loudly it echoed off the high ceiling. Leo stood and took a small bow. He looked out at all these wealthy, successful people, and for the first time he didn't feel small. He didn't feel invisible. He felt like exactly what his grandmother had always told him he was, a musician who had something valuable to share. Mrs. Harrington came up on the platform, her face wet with tears. She hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." Later that night, after the guests had left and the mansion had grown quiet, Leo drove home in his old truck. His phone was full of messages from people who'd been at the gala, asking if he gave lessons or performed at other events. Mr. Anderson had.